Okay, I'm going to get started because I don't want to keep you later than I have to. First of all, if you don't know me, my name is Louise Donohue, but I write under G.L. Robinson, and the reason is that my name is Glynis Louise. And growing up, I was called Glynis. But at boarding school, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, I was teased terribly because at that time, Guinness had an ad, a big billboard ad everywhere, and it said, Guinness is good for you. And so, of course, Guinness. You can see what happened. Everywhere I went, laugh. So I really hated it. So when I left school and went off to university, I introduced myself as Louise. So if you knew me before I was 18, I'm Glynis. If you've known me since I was 18, I'm Louise. Frank knows me as Louise and never knew my name. My name is Glynis Louise with a hyphen, but never knew me as Glynis at all. But when we go to England, of course, all my family calls me Glynis or Glyn. So it's like, who is this? So to stop the confusion, I called myself GL, and Robinson is my maiden name. And the reason why I chose to take a pen name was because I was afraid that my grandchildren would be embarrassed about having a grandmother who wrote these sort of stories about love, and that, they'd be embarrassed. So that was such a stupid decision that I made. But, now it's too late. I am what I am, and I've published now I think 11 books under this name, so I'm not going to go back and change it. But so just to tell you, that's the background of that. I just said that I was brought up in a boarding school. It was a convent. And the nuns, the superior nuns anyway, were all French. So I grew up, well, I didn't grow up speaking French, but I learned French in the convent. By the time I left, I could speak French. And I subsequently, when we moved here, became a French professor at Ithaca College. That's what I did for most of my working life. Not all of it, because before I came here, I worked at something totally different, but never mind about that. Frank and I met in Europe, in Brussels, which is where I was working at the time, again, because of my French. And he came over to Europe for supposedly 6 weeks to help out a guy. And he came back nearly 8 years later with a wife and 3 children. So that was... And he always said, we met at the British Embassy. There was a party at the British Embassy, and he always tells people he met me trying to steal the hubcaps from his car. Now, I didn't even know what a hubcap was in those days, so that's always been Frank's sense of humor, which I've lived with all these years anyway. So I just said I was a French professor. I did not start writing until 2018. And it never even occurred to me, other than writing academic stuff, very boring academic stuff. It didn't occur to me to write, but my sister died in 2018 unexpectedly. We were in the convent together, and we used to read the books by a writer called Georgette Hare. Maybe you've heard of her. They're all romances, historical romances, and we used to giggle under the covers when we were not supposed to be reading. And so I don't know what it is, but the day after my sister's funeral, I sat up in bed, and this is true, and I'm not a very fanciful person, really. I'm a very feet on the ground person, but sat up in bed, and this story came into my head, and I started writing it, and I haven't stopped since. And I'm sure it's my sister, really, in some way, and I think of her every day when I write, so that's good. And we always laugh at the same thing, so that's good too. So this kissing ball story, I've edited it down a bit because it would have been too long to read the whole thing. And it's in a collection. I have put out several of my other books, because people keep asking me, do you have your books? So I did bring some, but please don't feel obliged to buy them at all, but they are over there. Not the kissing ball, because I don't have any left, because I've sold them all. Anyway, here we go. A kissing ball. The Branson family always held a party at the beginning of the Christmas season on the 6th of December, St. Nicholas's Day. It was the habit of the house to hang a ball of mistletoe in the center of the entrance to the drawing room. This evening was no exception. A large kissing ball hung there in all its glory. But it was always fun, Quentin Stapleton chuckled to himself, to see how the unwed maidens. The more timid of them tended to scuttle to one side of the wide doorway, thus avoiding the perilous centre and the chance that a waiting gentleman might take the opportunity to plant a kiss upon their cheek. Not that they would so dislike being kissed, but they were so afraid the matrons clustered around the large room, watching the comings and goings with eyes, would stigmatize them as fast, that they dared not appear to court such an eventuality. The bolder young ladies walked quite slowly straight through the middle of the doorway, and might possibly even slow their steps just a little when the crucial moment was reached, not to encourage any available gentleman, you understand, but merely to show they didn't give a fig for the old-fashioned notions of the tabbies watching them narrowly through their lorgnette. What none of the beauties did was to walk slowly into the centre of the doorway, right under the green and white ball with its red ribbons, and stand there, immobile, scanning the room, while her pink cheek, framed by a mass of copper curls held back by a diamond clip, presented itself deliciously to any comer. But this one did. Quentin Stapleton was certain he had never seen her before in his life. He would have remembered. She was rather above average height, with a delicious figure, over which her golden gown shimmered as if over the top of a very firm jelly. The lure was irresistible. He took 3 long strides and was by her side, and placing his lips on the aforementioned cheek, so wonderfully soft and cool, before either she or anyone else could move. Startled, she placed one shapely white hand on the lapel of his fine, long-tailed coat and looked up at him, her dark brown eyes wide with surprise. Then she noticed the kissing ball. "Oh," she said in a pleasant voice, "how silly of me. I didn't see it. I was looking for someone." "Then it's my immeasurably good fortune that you should have chosen just that spot to stop and look," said Quentin. "I count it a Christmas blessing." She laughed unaffectedly. "What an elegant thing to say, Mr. Stapleton, Quentin Stapleton, at your service, ma'am." He bowed. "Well, Mr. Stapleton, I'm Laura Wentworth. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." She stepped back and curtsied. "Whom were you looking for?" he asked. "I must say I hope he or she is not here, so you will talk to me." He drew her into the room. "My fiancé," she said. "I was expecting to meet him here. No doubt I should have waited for the butler to present me, but he was momentarily occupied, and I just wandered in." Quentin Stapleton's heart, usually a most reliable of organs and not given to somersaults or leaps, fell to his brilliantly shiny boots. "Your fiancé?" he repeated dumbly. "Who is he?" "Nicholas Branson. This is where he lives, isn't it?" "Nicky Branson is your fiancé?" he said, unable to conceal his surprise. "Yes. Why are you looking like that?" "Oh, no reason. Just a little surprised. I know Nicky well, and he never mentioned being betrothed to you." "Well, he may have forgotten. It was all arranged so very long ago, you see, and I think our letter informing him of our coming may not have arrived. The post is so very unreliable." "Miss Wentworth, I know I must seem amazingly obtuse. Do I understand that Nicky may have forgotten he was betrothed to you, and the letter reminding him may not have arrived?" "Arrived from where?" "India." "Oh dear, I know it must seem a strange story." "Why don't you sit down and tell me all about it?" said Quentin, leading her to a small sofa set against the wall. "First, I'll send someone to look for Nicky. He's probably in the billiard room. In fact, he rather thought he was with his lady love, but he didn't say so. He left her for a moment to tell the butler to find the son of the house. This is not a joke, Grimshaw," he said seriously, "and I need to see him before he goes into the drawing room. It's important. If Miss Thomas is with him, get rid of her." "Now, Miss Wentworth, tell me the whole story," he said, coming back. "My father was best friends with Nicholas's father," she said, "before going to India to make his fortune. When we were born, Nicholas in London and I in India, our fathers pledged us to each other. My father spoke of it many times, and I have Mr. Branson's letters replying in the same vein. My father died 4 months ago after quite a long illness, and it was his dying wish that we come to London and that I be married to the son of his old friend. So Mamma wrote to Mr. Branson, but it was all such a rush. We wanted to leave before the monsoon set in, so we packed up and were on the boat before you could say knife. We kept expecting to hear from Mr. Branson, but when we didn't, I realized our letters must not have arrived. I saw the announcement of this party in the Gazette and came. I know it's not quite the thing, but I felt sure that Mrs. Branson, when she knew who I was, would introduce me. I'm afraid Mrs. Branson died last year, said Quentin. Mr. Branson Sr. was very cut up over it. I shouldn't be surprised if he never wrote. According to Nicky, he only held this party to honour the memory of his wife, who insisted on holding a party on the 6th of December every year. Nicholas is both her husband's and her son's name, you see. Quentin stopped and thought for a moment before saying with some hesitation, "Forgive me for presuming to ask questions that only a genuinely long-time friend could ask, but didn't it occur to you that you might take Nicky in dislike, or he you? Though," he added with a charming smile, "that would hardly seem possible." She smiled back. "I thought that we would like each other sufficiently for marriage. In India, most of the English couples I knew hardly met before being wed, so they weren't in love. But it seemed to work well enough. There was even sometimes a degree of affection." At that moment, the butler arrived, announcing in a low voice that Mr. Branson was in the library awaiting their pleasure. In fact, Nicky Branson's exact words had been, "What the devil does Quen want? Tell him I'm busy. I'll give him 5 minutes." Quentin gave Miss Wentworth his arm and led her into the library. When he opened the door and shepherded her in, the scion of the family was in front of the fire, his rather short legs spread in front of him, a sullen look on his rather weak-chinned face. "Miss Wentworth, this is Nicholas Branson. Nicky, this is Miss Wentworth," said Quentin quickly, "your fiancée." "My what?" Nicholas bolted up and goggled at them both. "From India," explained his friend. Nicholas stared at them. Then a look of realization came over his face. "You don't mean you're the daughter of the chap my father's been talking on and off about all these years?" "Yes," said Miss Wentworth. "I'm sorry to say I am. My father died earlier this year. We were promised to each other. Didn't you know?" "I did not." "My God, it can't be true." "I'm afraid it is. I have your father's letters, and almost the last thing my father said was I was to come to London and find you. But I take it your father told you nothing of the letter that we were leaving India?" "What letter? No, he said nothing." A look of comprehension came into his face. "No wonder he blew up just now when I told him I was thinking of popping the question to Amy. Since Mamma died, he's been all to pieces. Told me he would never agree to Amy, and he'd cut me off without a bean if I managed to displease him." There was silence. Then Miss Wentworth took a deep breath and said, "I understand then, Mr. Branson, that you wish to offer marriage to Miss Amy, and your father is refusing to allow you because of his promise to my father." "Yep, that seems to be about the sum of it," mumbled Nicholas. There seemed little to say after that. Quentin took her arm. "Come, Miss Wentworth," he said, "allow me to take you home. My carriage is outside." He firmly placed her arm under his and led her out into the hall. Nicholas Branson heaved himself out of the chair and walked irresolutely into the dining room. He spotted Amy Thomas, quickly took her arm and took her back into the library. "Look here, Amy," he said, "I now know why my father went into a fit when I suggested a betrothal with you. He had a very good friend from his Cambridge days who went to India, married a good sort of woman by all accounts, but he kept in touch with the old man. Well, I knew they had a girl, but what I didn't know was that he'd pledged that we'd be married one day. He never told me about it, pretty sure because Mamma wouldn't let him. But now she's gone, and he's all at sea, and he's damn well clutching to the old plan." "But where is this girl?" cried Amy wildly. "Is she here?" "Not any more. I told her I wanted to marry you, and she pushed off with old Quentin." "Does she want to marry you?" "Apparently she's come all this way to do it. Her pa's dead, and on his deathbed told her to seek me out." "What's she like?" Amy's feminine curiosity overcame the more important question of the moment. "Is she pretty?" "Oh, I don't know. She's all right. Tall, and, well, you know," he made a vague shape with his hands. "You mean she's well built?" "Well, something like that." "Red hair." "Red hair? Does she have freckles?" Miss Thomas was envisioning an unattractively large woman with frizzy red hair and freckles. She wasn't altogether displeased with the image. I know what I'll do, she said, clapping her hands together. I'll go and see her. I'll tell her she's ruining both our lives and she's bound to give you up. She doesn't love you. She doesn't even know you. Then she can explain to your father and he'll be released from any obligation. Do you think so? Said Nicholas doubtfully. Oh, give it a try, I suppose. Meanwhile, Quentin Stapleton had driven Miss Wentworth to the rather unfashionable area of London where she was staying. He saw her to the door and said that with her permission he would wait on her the following afternoon. Then he bowed and was gone. She entered the narrow hallway and immediately went up to see her mother. Mrs. Wentworth must have been lovely in her youth and was still a very pretty lady. She was wrapped in shawls by a blazing fire. Laura, she cried, come in and close the door. It's so cold. Tell me what happened. I'm sorry I wasn't up to coming. I wish I could shake off this grip. Did the Bransons greet you with open arms? Quite the reverse, I'm afraid to say, Mamma. Well, Mr. Branson wasn't there. Apparently he's still in mourning for the loss of his wife a year ago. His son Nicholas was there and not at all pleased to see me. He didn't know anything about the promise. His father hadn't mentioned we were coming, and anyway he's in love with another woman. But his father won't hear of it. Seems he's attached to the idea of carrying out the promise to his old friend. What a tangle. I remember Branson Senior well. He was a nice fellow. You'll just have to speak to him. You know as well as I that your papa would never hold you to a promise that would make anyone unhappy. The only thing is, my dear, I don't know how many months we can continue to live like this. You know your father left his affairs in a dreadful muddle. I loved him dearly, but he was never any good with money. And we simply had to buy ourselves some decent gowns to go about in, or we would certainly have been regarded as a couple of freaks. But I had no idea things were so expensive in London. If you don't marry young Branson, I don't know what we shall do. I know, Mamma, I know. But it's Christmas. Things will work out. She kissed her mother lovingly on the cheek and went to her own room and got into bed as quickly as she could. She lay there thinking of the hottest months in India, when they would go to the bungalow in the hills. It overlooked a lake surrounded by flame trees and rhododendrons. She smiled as she thought about it and soon fell asleep. The next afternoon, Laura was not really surprised to receive a call from Nicholas Branson's Amy. Seeing her looking at the rather shabby surroundings, Laura laughed. Yes, it is a bit mean, isn't it? That's the problem with hiring a house without any knowledge of the place you're going to. Mamma and I had no idea, but by the time we got here and sorted ourselves out, and Mamma caught a dreadful cold, we haven't had a chance to do anything about it. In fact, Miss Thomas was confused. Her hostess's gown was of the first stare and obviously costly, but the house, well. And she could see immediately that everything Nicky had said about his supposed fiancée was wrong. He had called her red-haired. Red-haired? She had the most glorious copper curls and was not remotely freckled. And yes, she was tall, much taller than Amy herself, but she wasn't at all fleshy. She was just, well, Miss Thomas was not fanciful, but she was forcibly reminded of the figure on the prow of a ship. And she was wearing a lovely green velvet day dress that accentuated the lights in her brown eyes. I expect you want to talk to me about this tangle, said Laura. Mr. Branson wants to marry you, but his papa wants him to marry me. Put it like that, it sounded so simple, and Amy leapt at it. Oh, yes, Miss Wentworth, that's it exactly. Would you talk to Nicky's father and tell him you don't want to marry his son? Yes, I was going to anyway. Since you're here, I'll write him a note now. Perhaps you'd give it to Nicholas to give to his father. In a very short time, Amy, who seemed to have nothing else to say, was taking her leave, and the hostess was breathing a sigh of relief. Not 30 minutes later, the knocker sounded again, and Quentin Stapleton was shown in. He paid no attention whatsoever to his surroundings, but came straight to Miss Wentworth and bent over her hand. I was afraid you would be downcast by yesterday evening, he said with a smile, but I see the opposite is true. No one could look less downcast. You are in full bloom. Mr. Stapleton, she said with a laugh, you are just the sort of man my governess warned me about. But I thank you for the pretty compliment. I don't know about full bloom, though. Both my mother and I are having an awful time with the cold and damp. I feel it more likely the flower may wither on the stalk. Then it's obvious you must come to the Christmas ball tonight at Lady March's. It will get so insufferably hot, we Londoners won't be able to stand it, but it will suit you to perfection. Say you will come. But will the hostess not object to an unknown woman being thrust upon her? No, Lady March is an old friend of mine. I've no doubt she'll be delighted. I'll call for you at 9. At 9 o'clock that evening the knocker sounded, and there he was to help her into his carriage. In the confusion the night before, Laura had not noticed the coat of arms on the door. She commented upon it as soon as they were both settled. Yes, my grandfather insisted on having the coat of arms on all the family conveyances, and I suppose we've never done anything about it. I don't even notice it myself. But have you a noble family? Well, yes, but nothing very grand. A very low-level viscount, I assure you. I usually don't mention it. It raises people's expectations. From this, Laura understood her friend was the scion of a family with noble lineage, but no money. It sounds grand to me, she said with a laugh. Should I curtsy when I enter your presence? No, I prefer you stand stock-still under a ball of mistletoe so I could kiss you again. Oh, yes, I'd forgotten that, said Laura with a laugh. What with all the other revelations, it went right out of my mind. That was very bad of you, you know, now that I think about it. It's a good thing I'm not a vapourish kind of miss. I might have had a spasm. Quentin was not used to having his kisses forgotten so easily, but answered lightly, You didn't look at all vapourish. If you had, I shouldn't have wanted to kiss you. No, agreed his companion. I'm too big for that. I've never been able to pretend to be weak. You know, I've never fainted in my life. Neither have I, said her partner, so that's something we already have in common. The crowd was dense outside the March home in Mayfair, but under Quentin's gentle but firm guidance, in no time, it seemed, they were waiting to be announced at the ballroom door. There were 4 blazing fireplaces in the huge ballroom. It was, as Quentin had said, very warm, for which Laura was very grateful. She was wearing her one ball gown, and it had short sleeves, though she wore long gloves. It was a heavy silk in a dull ruby red, the low-cut bodice embroidered with pearls. She wore nothing around her neck, but from her ears hung a pair of fine diamond drop earrings, an inheritance from her late grandmother. She had been wearing her cloak when Quentin picked her up, and when he saw her now, as it were, revealed, he caught his breath. She looked glorious. The pearls on her bodice highlighted her magnificent bosom, and the diamonds shone in the candle and firelight. Lady March and her husband greeted her kindly, and when she explained she had just arrived from India, Lord March said immediately, Then we must have the Plimptons invite you to their Christmas dinner next week. Old Plimpton spent years over there. He'll want to hear what's been going on since he left. I remember them, said Laura with pleasure. Of course, I was much younger then, so I didn't exactly socialize with them, but my mother will be delighted to see them again. Then I'll make sure you both receive an invitation, said Lord March. Now, said Quentin, we will get dance cards from the ballmaster, and I shall sign my name immediately to the waltzes. Otherwise you will get snapped up. He was right, and she hardly saw him at all, except during the waltzes. Then the feel of his strong, warm hand in the small of her back sent an altogether unaccustomed shiver through her body. Are you cold? He asked solicitously. Shall I fetch your shawl? Oh, no, she said. In fact, I think I'm warm for the first time since I arrived in London. I don't know what made me shiver, but she did. The following day saw Laura being ushered into Mr. Branson's study. Her host rose and pressed her hand meaningfully, then bade her sit down. He was a man of medium height, stocky like his son, and with what she saw was a weak chin hidden under a well-groomed beard. She sniffed the scent of cigars appreciatively. Oh, the scent will always make me think of my father, she said. Oh, yes, said Mr. Branson, how your father and I talked and smoked and talked and lived. What times we had. He was everything I was not, lively, popular, full of adventure. I was always quieter and more given to reflection, but everywhere he went there was fun. Those were some of the best days of my life. When he said he was going to seek his fortune in India, I was devastated. But he was lucky enough to find a wife who would follow him. Poor woman, she must be feeling her loss most deeply too. You will forgive my asking, Miss Wentworth, but I feel my lifelong friendship with your father permits me to ask an indiscreet question. Did my old friend make the fortune he sought by going so far away? In fact, they had left India with rather little, but Laura decided there was no need to wash all their linen in public. Well, I dare say he did not do as well as he had hoped, but I don't think he ever regretted his decision to leave England. But her host was more astute than she had realized. "Ah, you are protective of your father, as a daughter should be. I commend you for it. But you have no need to worry. When you are married to my son, you will have enough and more to provide the elegancies of life, and your dear mother will not be forgotten." For a moment, Laura thought, yes, why not? Here was the solution to their problems. She could keep her promise to her father and provide for her mother in one swoop. But then her good sense intervened. "But my dear sir, surely you're not still envisioning a match between Nicholas and myself? You know he's in love with Miss Thomas and she with him. It would be cruelty to force him into marriage with me." "Nonsense. He knows his duty. It is to wed where I direct. There's no question of Miss Thomas. It's a passing fancy, no more." "But, sir, I know my father would not expect me to keep a promise to him under these conditions." "Ah, you promised him. Then it must and shall be so. Remembering your duty to him will bring you all the happiness you need." Laura realized she had made a mistake in mentioning the word promise. "But, sir, you must have known couples who were forced into a marriage of convenience and were dreadfully unhappy as a consequence." "I know it is the modern idea that a couple should meet and fall in love," he replied, "but that is just a new-fangled notion. Why, I had barely ever seen my dear wife Hermione before we were betrothed, and yet we were very happy together." Laura thought it was probably because Nicky's father was a man easily led. The weak chin told the tale. He had been drawn to her father because he was so much stronger, and she didn't doubt the late Mrs. Branson was a very masterful woman. But like many weak persons, he was obviously stubborn. It was useless to argue. As she went home, Laura reflected how much her ideas had changed in the last 3 days. She had been happy enough to follow her father's wishes and been prepared to marry a man she didn't know, to bear his children and make an agreeable home for him. But a tall man with laughing blue eyes and a strong warm hand in the small of her back had shown her that feelings towards a man could be much more than mere affection. Marrying for comfort and stability no longer seemed enough. But there still remained the twin problems of Mr. Branson's stubborn adherence to an idea formed 20 years ago, and the fact that she and her mother simply could not carry on much longer without funds. What was she to do? Were it not for the nagging worry about her and her mother's future, Laura would have very much enjoyed the Christmas season in London. The very air smelled of Christmas. It was full of the delicious scent of the street vendors' roasted chestnuts and the greens brought up from the country, bunches of ivy, holly, and mistletoe. Others sold dried fruits and sweetmeats, and little fancies tied up in coloured paper. Added to this throng were the carolers who would set up on street corners, a cap on the ground, for the pennies of passers-by. When Quentin found out she was taking a hackney just for the pleasure of riding through the streets, he began inviting her to see all the sights. She would have gone with him every day, but she forced herself to return to see Mr. Branson. His whole delight seemed to be talking about his late wife and the friendship with her father, and begged her constantly to return. To avoid the subject of her marriage, Laura kept up the fiction that her mother was ailing long after she was fully well. One day, when the butler was showing her out, Nicholas surged from the library and urgently took her arm. "I wish to talk to Miss Wentworth, Grimshaw. I'll see her out afterwards." No sooner was the library door closed than Nicholas thrust a letter into her hand. "Read this," he said. "Dear Mr. Branson, I'm sorry to inform you the understanding between us must now be at an end. My eyes have been opened to the kind of man you are. You have made no attempt to convince your father of your determination to marry me. I can only assume you find the prospect of marriage to Miss Wentworth preferable. Even if you do have feelings for me, I need not say that I find a man unable to fight for the woman he says he loves unacceptable as a husband. With best wishes for your future happiness, I am, yours sincerely, Amy Thomas." "How the devil did she think I could persuade my father?" cried Nicholas. "You know what he's like. He won't listen to reason. And what does she mean by fight for the woman he says he loves? Does she seriously think I could fight my own father?" "I'm sure she doesn't mean that, Mr. Branson," said Laura soothingly, although privately she thought Amy was right. He should fight more. Miss Thomas is very upset and not herself. I think you should write and reassure her of your undying love. That's all she wants, you know." And as she went home, Laura daydreamed of Quentin saying those very words to her. The Plimptons' Christmas dinner arrived, as it always did, the day before Christmas Eve. Lord and Lady March had been as good as their word, and both ladies were invited. It was Mrs. Wentworth's first social outing, and she was thrilled to be going out. It was a very pleasant evening, and Laura had been pleased to see her mother so welcomed and at home with her old friends. But she was forced to confront two realities. First, for her mother to enjoy the sort of company and society she was born to, they would need a great deal more money. As it was, they could barely afford to stay in the second-rate establishment they presently occupied, and how long was it before their situation became widely known and invitations ceased? But worse than that, she finally acknowledged to herself that she was in love, and she was almost sure her feelings were reciprocated. She had found her eyes drawn irresistibly to Quentin Stapleton as he sat far away from her at the table. She knew he looked towards her too, and once their eyes had met, he had smiled at her, and that shiver had gone down her spine. But it was impossible. It was a dreadful prospect, but she needed to marry where there was money, and what was it Quentin had said? He was a very low-level viscount. As he handed them into the carriage at the end of the evening, Quentin pressed her hand and murmured, "I want to talk to you. I must talk to you. When may I find you alone?" Laura shook her head and muttered something in refusal, not knowing what she said. She knew what he wanted to ask her, and she knew what she would have to say. She just couldn't bear it. As they neared their home, tears came uncontrollably to her eyes, so that when he helped her down from the carriage, she kept her head lowered and would not look at him. Hardly was she on the flagway before she rushed indoors. Mrs. Wentworth was astonished at her daughter's lack of manners. "I'm sorry, Lord Stapleton," she said. "I hope Laura isn't coming down with what I just recovered from. This behaviour is so unlike her. I can't understand it." When she went into her room, Laura was face down on her bed, sobbing as if her heart would break. "Whatever is the matter, my dear?" cried her mother. "Have you the headache? Let me go and find my lavender water. That will help." "No, mamma, no," sobbed Laura. "It's not that." And out it all came. Miss Thomas had dropped Mr. Branson, and if his father learned of it, he would push all the harder for Laurie to marry his son. And she didn't want to marry him. She was in love with Lord Stapleton, and she thought Lord Stapleton loved her. But how could she go back on her promise to her father if the man he had wanted her to marry was free and available because his would-be fiancé had left him, and it was all her fault? And poor Mr. Branson, he was already miserable because his wife had died, and what would he do if his long-held desire concerning her marrying his son was also thwarted? And if she didn't marry Nicholas, how would they live? He was well off. Lord Stapleton had told her he didn't have any money. Her words tumbled together. She was barely coherent. Her mother gently soothed her until her passion had cried itself out. Then she said, "Laura, my love, how can you think for a minute that there is any consideration more important than your happiness? Your father, for all his faults, would never have wanted you to keep your word to him if it meant your being unhappy. And what the two Mr. Bransons may do is their affair, not yours. You are in no way responsible for them. If Lord Stapleton wants to marry you and you want to marry him, there is no more to be said. We shall manage. We always have, and we always will. My poor dear, what a dreadful time you've had. It will work out, I promise." Laura thought she would never sleep, but to her surprise she slept well into the following morning, waking to a Christmas Eve in bright sunshine. It had been very cold overnight, and when she looked from her bedroom window she saw the frost on the trees shining in the sunlight. London suddenly seemed like a fairyland. Her cares seemed to fall away. Things would work out. What had Quentin called it when he kissed her under the mistletoe? A Christmas blessing. Yes, a blessing. That's what she felt that morning. She lay back in a daydream about Quentin, his charming smile, his bright blue laughing eyes, his kindness. What did it matter if they had no money? Mamma said they would manage, and they would. He was a viscount, even if he was poor, so he had the entree everywhere, and they would too. Mamma would have congenial society, and she would have Quentin. That's all she wanted. She would tell Mamma. But when she got downstairs, to her surprise, there was a note from her mother telling her she had gone out on an errand. A little while later, Laura was surprised by the door knocker. Who would be calling on Christmas Eve? She opened the door herself. In front of her stood Quentin Stapleton, carrying a large ball of mistletoe bedecked with ribbons. He stepped in and shut the door, and before she could say a word, he held the kissing ball above her head with one hand and drew her towards himself with the other. He kissed her until she was breathless, and then he kissed her again. "Now let's go inside and decide when we are to be married," he said. "But are we to be married?" "I should give you a hint. When a woman allows you to enter her home where she is quite alone and kisses you passionately, it has to be assumed that she is prepared to marry you. Of course, such behavior might be usual in India, but here in London it's considered quite scandalous." "Oh, it's scandalous in India too. But I didn't kiss you, you kissed me. That can easily be remedied. But you must be frozen standing out here in the hall. Let's go in by the fire, and you may kiss me." They suited the action to the word, and the next half hour was spent very pleasurably indeed. "You know, Quentin, if we marry," said Laura, a little shyly, looking up at him, "I hope you don't mind if my mother lives with us. I promise you we are neither of us expensive, and we have been used to the strictest economy." "But naturally she may live with us. And why should you practice the strictest economy? I can afford a wife, you know." "It's kind of you to say so, but I know you're not wealthy. You told me." "When did I tell you such a thing?" "In the carriage, when we were talking about the coat of arms. You said you were a lowly Viscount, and you didn't like to raise people's expectations." Viscount Stapleton laughed. "I meant we were lowly in the sense it's not a very old family. It only dates from the 1600s. But I'm glad to tell you, my love, that I'm quite well off. Better off than old Nicky, in fact." "Thank goodness," said Laura, then realized what she had said. "Oh, I don't mean thank goodness because you're rich. I would marry you and live in a hovel, but it makes it so much easier for my mother. She's always had to worry about money. Not anymore. I owe her so much, I'll settle anything she wants upon her." "You owe her?" "Yes. She wrote me a letter this morning telling me to come and make you marry me. She said not to take no for an answer." He thought for a moment. "My darling, do you want me to propose properly, down on one knee?" "I think I would. I seem to have become such a romantic. Just 3 weeks ago I was perfectly ready to marry a man who hadn't proposed at all. I know it's silly, but would you?" In answer, the Viscount drew Laura to her feet and then went on one knee before her. "My dear Miss Wentworth," he said, looking up into her eyes, "would you do me the honour of—" But before he could finish, there was a step in the hall and the drawing-room door was pushed open. "Oh, there you are," said Mrs. Wentworth, coming into the room, still in her pelisse and bonnet. "And Lord Stapleton. Good. I have some important news." Quentin had risen somewhat awkwardly to his feet and now said, "Am I included in the news, or should I leave you?" "No, stay, stay," came the reply. "This concerns you too. At least I expect it does." She flung off her very becoming bonnet and sat down. "I am to be married," she said firmly, "to Mr. Branson Senior." "What?" "No, Mamma," cried Laura. "There's not the least need. Quentin is rich. He can provide for us both." "But, my dear," said her mother, "I wish to be married. I'm not so old that I've given up on the company of gentlemen. I knew Mr. Branson before I married your father, and I always liked him, though he was overshadowed by your father at the time. When I went to see him today, I was simply going to tell him not to be such a goose, and to allow his son to marry where he liked, and allow you to do the same. But when I saw him, the years fell away. I felt like a girl again. Besides, the poor man needs a wife. He simply cannot manage on his own. His melancholy and stubborn refusal of all change over the last year is proof enough of that." And it was clear he felt the same. He greeted me with such affection, and the minute we began talking, it was like the old days. Anyway, it's all arranged. You shall marry your Quentin, if I may call you that. She turned to her future son-in-law and received a smiling nod. "And I shall marry Mr. Branson. Now, I'll leave you to finish what you were doing." She turned to go and then turned back. "And oh, I forgot to tell you, young Nicky is to marry Miss Thomas. It seems that this very morning he had gone boldly into his papa and told him that even if he was cut off without a penny, he would marry where he chose. My Nicholas told me he was so surprised at that show of determination, a thing he had rarely seen from his son, he agreed at once to the betrothal. And With that, she left them. "Well," said Laura, turning to her almost fiancé, "what an amazing outcome. Whoever would have imagined such a thing?" "It's a Christmas blessing for us all, to be sure," smiled Quentin Stapleton, Viscount. "Now, if we may take up where we left off." He knelt on one knee again. "Miss Wentworth, my dear Laura." The end. So, all of my stories are like that. It's always a problem, but it always works out in the end. I gave you these, and just to let you know what it is, because it's not terribly easy to read. On the front, where the umbrella is, there is my website, which is romancenovelsbyglrobinson.com. You don't have to put in the HTTPS. Just go to the search and put in romance novels, all one word, by glrobinson.com. And I will send you a short story if you send me your email. And this is a QR code. If you want to just hover your phone over it on the photo, on the camera, it'll go automatically to the website. And then on the back is a lovely picture of me. Maybe you don't recognize me with my sunglasses on. But anyway, it's got my Amazon page too. So if you want to see all the books, you can. By the way, on my website, I have recorded the first chapter of all my books, so you can listen to them and see if you like them. And then there's a couple of quotes from my reviews anyway. And I did bring some books with me in case you should want them. I wasn't going to do that, and I normally wouldn't have done, but my daughter always says to me, "Oh, Mum, you have books, why don't you take them with you?" So I did, anyway, so there we are. And any questions? I think we have a few minutes. I deliberately didn't go for too long. Yes?
Louise?
Yes.
When you write your stories, what do you research the facts in? You've got a special book that...
No. Well, to tell you the truth, the 19th century was my specialization in literature, which I taught for a long time. So I know the history very well, both in England and in France, actually. And also, I have my whole life read those Georgette Hare books. And she's better than an encyclopedia. So really, I don't do it. There's not much in it. This story is longer, but I realized it would take probably an hour or more to read the whole thing. So I cut out bits about the Messiah, which I did do some research to find out when that was in London, which was actually during this time period. About Yule logs, which I knew all about that anyway, but I cut it all out, so you didn't get much of the sort of historical background. But if I'm writing something and I want to know, for example, I wanted to know the other day, what was the date when they started putting rubber on carriage wheels? I don't know. What do? I look it up on Google. I mean, you can do open heart surgery on Google, so you don't need to know anything. You can just look it up. Yes, that's right. So basically, I use what I know in my head, and then if I do need to something very esoteric, I look it up. Yeah.
Louise, how are you going to change your lifestyle once you become mom?
Oh, I'm going to give it all to Trinity Church. Yes, wouldn't that be great? I don't know. A friend of ours who's also a writer said lightning has to strike for you to become famous, because there are so many writers but I'm happy to say that I've only been doing this since 2018, as I said, so it's actually 3 years almost to the day when I published my first book. And I'm doing quite well. When it's funny, when you write and you publish your books and then somebody actually buys it, you think, gosh, wow, how did that happen?
It's almost like I suckered one in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's somebody who has more money than sense, But actually, I do. Nowadays, I sell between 5 and 10 a day. I sell a lot of books. It's surprising, isn't it? Yeah.
The performance aspect of it.
I beg your pardon?
The performance aspect of it is great. Read it so beautiful.
Oh, reading, yes. Well, I like to read. It's because I'm so bossy. And I was a teacher my whole life, so I really. Yeah, you're right. I do, but I do believe you have to be a bossy person to read nicely.
Control the audience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can I also make another comment?
Mhm.
When you describe the very handsome and secretly rich Viscount,
Yeah.
why is it that Frank comes into it? Which one, handsome or rich?
Yes, I think, all of my books have these super handsome heroes, of course, and the heroines, if that's what we call them. They're not actually not supposed to use the word heroine anymore because it sounds like a drug, So you have to call it the female character or something like that. Anyway, all of my heroines are sort of good looking in different ways. The one over there, which is called the Red-Headed Hornet, I like a lot because the heroine in that is incredibly bossy, so she really is like me, and it was great. I just loved it. I could make her absolutely outrageous, and she is trying to get her brother. She's twins. I was a twin. My mother has twins, and I have twins. So twins a lot in our family, and so twins are in that book too. And Amelia, her name is Amelia's brother. Is her twin, and he's a really handsome guy, but sort of a bit of a doofus, and she is very, very bossy. She's bossed him around all her whole life, and now she gets a job with this earl or something. They're all earls and Regency novels, everybody in it is noble. You have to understand that is the trope. You can't write it otherwise. They're all rich and handsome and beautiful, and they spend their whole time going to balls and kissing each other's face. It's just if you don't like that, then you can't read them because it's just that's the way it is. Anyway, so she gets a job with this earl, and then basically bosses him into changing his whole lifestyle to her benefit. That's what it comes down to, and that sort of made me laugh. And then
that reminds me of.
Yes, well, that's it, exactly. That's exactly what I've done with Frank. Yes, precisely. He's a boss. That's what he says. Anyway, my latest book, which actually there isn't a copy of it over there because I don't have any copies left, is it's called The Lord and the Blue Stocking, and in that one, I like that one because the Lord is actually on the Asperger's spectrum. He's a really nice guy and very good looking, of course. But he has very awkward, especially in society, and doesn't respond to social cues and so on and so forth. I did do research for that, by the way. That's something I did research carefully because I wanted it to be genuine and not be offensive at all. And I think my reviewers told me, a couple of them actually have family members, and they said, "Oh no, you really nailed it." They were happy with it. I was happy with it. Anyway, in that one, that's a sort of different sort of a relationship altogether because of the nature of it. So, and then there's one over there. Which one is it? I think it's Cecilia. Cecilia is very tall and thinks she's never going to get married because she's too tall. And that I respond to that because I remember as a girl thinking, nobody is ever going to love me because I was always so tall, and I was in this convent anyway. I can imagine. Yeah, there weren't any men around. We weren't even allowed out. So we only saw the gardener, and he was about 95. So I didn't have any experience dealing with men at all, and thought, oh, nobody's ever going to love me. So I sort of do understand that, but of course she does find somebody who loves her. Of course, they're all the same. They all, that they're going to they're all going to end up happily ever after, except. There is sometimes a bad guy in there who gets his comeuppance, but even that's not too bad. So there you go. I can tell you. Oh, the cat! Yes, that's very interesting. You should bring that up. I learned a lot from that. I said to myself, what's going to make people interested in my book? I thought, have a cat in it. And so you're right. It's called The Cat, the Lord. Course, the Lord and the Cat's Meow, and that's about a girl called Wilhelmina, named actually for my granddaughter Nina, because Nina's not first of all, it's not an English name at all, and certainly not a 19th century name, because I am careful to use names that are I do try for historical accuracy, absolutely. So I thought, how am I going to get somebody called Nina? And I decided I have to call the person Wilhelmina, and that she calls herself Nina because that's the only thing she could pronounce when she was little, So that's how I got around it. So she's called Nina. Yes, and that book is basically about the fact that the first animal rights law was passed in England actually in 1825, which is part of this period goes from about 1800 to 1830 that I write in. So 1825 was okay. And she's an animal rights activist, particularly for the horses who drew all the carriages. You know, the Hackney carriages in London, of course, were all horse-drawn, and they were treated extremely badly. There's no doubt about it. So she gets into all that, and she meets this lord and basically foists this kitten upon him. And the last thing he wants is a kitten, but having got the kitten, of course, becomes attached to it, and the cat very attached to him, to the point where he's engaged to somebody that the cat knows is absolutely the wrong person, and causes that whole thing to fall apart. So he ends up, of course, marrying Wilhelmina. You guessed that in the beginning. Whoever seemed the two most unlikely to get married are the ones who do get married.
You got to write one with no humans, just all cats.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, actually, you can laugh about that, but Frank and I have decided we're going to together write a scheme for this new Amazon thing called Vella. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's like Charles Dickens. You know how he used to put an episode a week or something? Well, on Amazon they have a new thing called Vella where you can purchase an episode a week. And I'm going to write one story, and Frank's going to write, we're going to go on and off. Every week we're going to write a story about our daughter's dog called Mr. Terrific. Mr. Terrific, the dumbest dog in the world. And we are going to write a whole series of episodes about it's going to be called The Adventures of Mr. Terrific. And it is going to be entirely about the dog. But I've just written one that has a dog in it, a dog, humans as well, though, because the cat was so successful. I thought, oh, well, I'll write one with a dog. So I did. Won't come out till the end of next year, but that was fun too. I really have such fun, right? If you don't have something to do, write a book. It is really, really fun. Frank writes a book. He's been writing since the middle of COVID because he was sick of looking at the back of my neck because I'm always like this. And I said, oh, for heaven's sake, write a story. And he did, and he's published them. He's written, what, 7? The novellas, the little short stories. Seriously. So you see, we
made a fortune.
Yes.
Unbelievable. Unbelievably well.
Unbelievable wealth.
But
Yeah.
you're leaving to Trinity, right?
Yes, you're leaving it to Trinity. Absolutely.
Anyway, look for Mr. Terrific.
It will come out for a while.
Is it from the dog's point of view? Or
Oh, Mr. Terrific is yes, the dog's point of view. He doesn't understand anything, but he's going to somehow, things are going to happen okay for Mr. Terrific because he really is a terrific dog. In true life, he's a terrific dog, as dumb as a bag of rocks, but sweet, so sweet, and so a head. It looks like a cinder. It's the same color as that couch, and its head is this big, and it puts it on your knee. And it's so heavy you can hardly bear it. And looks at you with these eyes. You sweet dog, really. So that's Mr. Terrific. Anything else? Thank you for being so patient and for us a great audience. Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.